Let's face it, parenting is the most important job on earth. Every day presents a stack of different challenges, and more often than not, the answer is outside of the box. On this podcast, we will offer proven strategies, interview pioneers in education, give insights into how to be successful parents, and even share our imperfect experiences of being parents ourselves. We're all in on this journey, and we will span the globe to find out what is working and who has the answers. This is the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. Here are your hosts, Darren McCarthy and Brian Powers.
Three, two, one. Welcome to the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. I'm Brian Powers.
And I'm Darren McCarthy.
And we're here together for a change, not over the phone. It's good to
live in the kitchen.
And today we're in Austin, Texas. No, we're not physically in Austin, Texas, but we're talking to Dr. Erika Vivyan from Austin, Texas, a psychologist who works with children and families.
Yeah, she's covering the topic of behavior.
The ABCs of behavior.
Antecedent, behavior, consequence. You're going to hear it time and time again, and it's going to be really, really helpful. I heard this statement about 25 years ago, and it changed everything about the way I saw behaviors, because all I was seeing before was behaviors, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, she definitely walks us through. She was great and did a blog post for us before this for us to check out and then and share with you guys. And then it gave us kind of the framework for our conversation. So she walks us through those ABCs, those three items, and then we talk about incidents in our own life where we and kind of talk them over with her and how we could do them either better or they were handled the way she would suggest.
Yeah, she did the impromptu, give me what you got.
We said, can we sit down on the couch? And she said, sure.
She absolutely has kind of a different background. There's a lot of people when you go, searching for speakers to like who's going to contribute the most about this topic.
Yep.
And so what I liked about her was she had a background in the school system. So she does assessments, and she's been in the IEP process.
Yep.
And she also has her own private practice. So she sees the whole thing. It's not just like I'm in private practice and I'm not really concerned about what they're doing in school. She knows what that looks like.
Correct. And it was nice to, again, like I said, kind of have a seat on the proverbial couch in her office virtually. And look, if you're in Austin or in Texas or anywhere close, definitely check her out. Or if you want to reach out to her, through her website, she will get you all that information. But this was really to, get you some actionable items and try to relate, if you relate to us and what's going on in our homes and how we can help our kids.
Yeah, the idea is that you learn like we just learned.
Exactly. So let's get our learn on.
Here we go. Dr. Erika Vivyan.
Hello, Dr. Erika Vivyan. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So Dr. Erika from Austin, anxiety and OCD specialist. Just tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you provide service-wide to the folks you work with.
Yeah, of course. So I am a licensed psychologist working in Texas. My training is actually in school psychology. I got my educational psychology degree from University of Wisconsin, so go Badgers. And therefore my focus is really on working with school-age kiddos, 3 up through mid-20s, because we know that's where school's going these days. And I work a lot with kids, teens, young adults, and their families on anxiety, stress, and behavior. So I often have kiddos come in with different anxiety disorders or sometimes ADHD, sometimes both. And we work together to figure out essentially what is perpetuating some of those behaviors and how both the kids and the parents can help to improve their lives by changing those behaviors. So that's a little bit of what I do on a regular basis. I do both therapy sessions, like weekly therapy sessions, and I also do some more in-depth psychological assessments. So that's essentially what I'm doing here in Texas right now.
Sure.
Well, that'll all keep you very busy.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
No, and you kind of highlighted on behavior, and you'd sent us, a blog post before this call that, we kind of want to work off of and then share with our listeners after the fact, but really the ABCs of behavior. And maybe we can start there and talk a little bit about that.
Of course. So as y'all were talking about different behaviors, both from your kids and the kids of other parents that you're working with, often kids' behavior and teenagers' behavior is just completely baffling to adults. Sometimes our own behavior is baffling to us. But one way that behavioral psychologists really think about behavior is through this framework of the ABCs. And it's just a really easy way to remember 3 big ideas that can help you to understand why a behavior is occurring and what we can do as adults on a kiddo's team to help to change that behavior if that's something that we want. So I'll start off with the A, which I think is the hardest one to remember because the A stands for antecedent. It's not a word that we hear all the time.
Sure.
So the word antecedent, it essentially means whatever happened before the behavior that we're most interested in exploring. So often we think first of the immediate antecedent or the trigger for a behavior. When we're thinking about kiddos, we think about triggers as things that might start a tantrum, or a trigger as something that might make a kiddo feel mad or sad. So we look at whatever happens immediately before the behavior. Sometimes that's a sibling taking your toy away, or sometimes that's a teacher yelling at them at school. But whatever happens to immediately trigger the behavior is really important for us to understand why that behavior is occurring.
Is that typically an event, or is that kind of a circumstance as well? Like I'm tired and I've had a long day, or I haven't eaten, or?
Yeah, that's a great question because the trigger itself, the immediate antecedent, is what we would say as an event, like something that happens to trigger that emotion. But we also definitely consider those setting events, like having a bad day at school, or my favorite setting event for my own behavior is if I'm getting hangry. So we think about how that person is reacting in the context of their whole day, their week, their month, and their year. So thinking about what's going on in this kid's or this teenager's life to sort of set them up for, okay, this trigger hit, and then we see that behavior. So we look both at the immediate antecedents and what we would call the setting events. So whatever else has been going on in their life prior to that trigger.
Yeah, I know I often forget, not all the time, but some of the time, that to relate to them, to my 3 little ones, and say, like you just said, am I hangry? Are they hangry? What's going on? When, did they get breakfast in this morning? And is that kind of the issue? But it's difficult because, goes back to also the teaching them to communicate as well, what's going on and why they're feeling that way.
Well, it's interesting, Dr. Erika, because sometimes we don't, there's a series of days or of events that kind of happen, and we don't realize the antecedent until we kind of look back in time. Mm-hmm. And so I think we have a tendency to say, okay, well, what just caused it? There's a whole process here. And as a parent, you finally get to realize that someday you start to realize, okay, it's not just about a behavior. It's about the antecedent. And then there's a tracking to try to figure out, well, what is the cause, and is it something that kind of continuously happens? Do you have an observation pattern for, a way for them to kind of get an idea of this?
Yeah, for sure. So it's funny that you say that once you start to envision the pattern, it really helps you to figure out why this behavior is occurring consistently. So that's something that we definitely look for from a behavioral psychology lens, to say, okay, well, we've noticed that there's a pattern in this behavior. And as not fun as that is to say, okay, there's a pattern of tantrums going on right after school. Well, now we have some data to say, okay, it's happening right after school, and we can go back and look at both those triggering events. So maybe it's that coming home from school event, and then look back at all those antecedents. And now you have some more data to say, okay, I can understand why this is happening every day after school, or every Monday after school, because Mondays are hard, or every Sunday night, because everyone tends to get the Sunday scaries to some degree. So we look for that specific data to say, okay, like this is our pattern. And even though finding a pattern of bad behavior is not fun, it gives you more information that you can use to then go around and help that kiddo.
Yeah, it took us a while. So with my oldest, his big thing is, he has to get on the bus in the morning. So where most kids would love to have their parents drive them, he has to get on the bus. So that's his, starts his day. And it took my wife and I a while to realize that's his thing, so that's his event, more a little bit in a positive way that kind of kicks off his day. Maybe, I don't know, maybe he gives him time to relax before he gets to school. Who knows? But when we need to make it so that he gets on that bus on time and is not, throwing him off.
Right. Yeah, because that can be a huge setting event for anybody's day. If you're running late to the bus, or if one of us is running late to the office, then it really sets you up to have a harried, frantic day. And then when one thing goes wrong, that's the trigger, and it might be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Yep. So remembering that with our kids as well can be really helpful in just better understanding and being more empathetic with those behaviors that we don't want to see so much.
No, it's a good point.
So that's the A, the antecedent. What's the B?
Right. So B is an easy one. B is for behavior, but we include it because we really want to get clear about the definition of the behavior that we are most interested in. Sometimes, usually, that behavior is a problem behavior, like a tantrum or a word we don't want to be hearing or whining. But sometimes that behavior could be something really positive that we want to see more of. Like, hey, how did that happen? I want to see more of that. Like when kiddos start making their bed or doing their laundry, like, ooh, how did that happen? I want to learn more. So when we define the behavior, it makes it way easier for us as adults to be really clear about then what antecedents we're looking at. So for example, if we were looking at on-task behaviors, maybe during homework time, we're looking at, okay, how often is this kiddo actually on task during homework time? How can we really get in there and define that clearly? As a behaviorist, I think really critically about what we can observe. So what's the observable behavior we see if a kiddo is on task during homework time? That means maybe that their pencil is in hand and they're looking at the paper. But if their pencil is down, or they're looking out the window or at their brother or sister, they're probably not on task. So when I go into classrooms or even in my office and work with families on what the behavior is that we're really looking at, I will full on start a timer and say, okay, well, for 80% of this session or 80% of this class, kiddo was off task because they were looking out the window. And that's good information to have, just to be really clear about this is the behavior we're looking for, and then defining that opposite is whatever the behavior is that we're not looking for.
Sure.
How do you differentiate between a behavior and a personality type? And kind of, I think there's this fine line. I could see it. I can see it myself, where it's kind of like, okay, my son is I'll call him a sensitive kid in my head. Right. And so, well, he's not being disrespectful or doing something that he's not appropriately supposed to do. He's sensitive. And I think we kind of give ourselves the excuse sometimes of a label, like being sensitive, or that's just who they are, to get around the behavior. So, does that make sense to you? Like what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, for sure. Especially when we're dealing with the idea of labels in terms of personality traits, or labels in terms of, in the world of psychology, we have diagnoses. So sometimes I will have a kiddo who we know has a diagnosis of ADHD, and they are really off topic in my therapy session. Is that something that I should expect? Yeah. Is that something that I can still measure? of course, because I want to know that what I'm doing in that session is still benefiting the kiddo. So when we think about kiddos' personality traits, we think about, okay, well, what are the behaviors that we can help them to continue to improve, even within their own personality and their strengths and weaknesses as a kiddo? So looking at behavior is not necessarily trying to change the inherent personality of any individual, but it does really help us to think about, okay, well, if my kiddo is really sensitive, which those are my most favorite kiddos, I love working with my emotionally sensitive ones. It's easier to say, okay, well, this kiddo is sensitive, and we can still help him in the way that he's reacting to a certain trigger, or in the way that he's reacting to having a rough day. That personality trait doesn't limit where we can look at his behavior.
Well, that's one of the things that I've seen through the course of time is that some parents kind of almost define themselves by the label that their child carries.
Yeah.
And other parents are in no other way to put it, but like in denial about the label their child should carry, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure.
How do you kind of balance those two things and fill the parents in to understanding the difference between the two and really honing in on the behavior, which is sometimes more important than the label, right?
Yeah, for sure. I definitely tend to take the stance in my therapy sessions, especially if a family comes in with or without a diagnosis, but particularly without. I define all of the behaviors and symptoms as the things that I'm seeing and hearing in session. So whether or not that kiddo has an ADHD label, I can still say, well, this is inattentive behavior because he's not looking at the paper that we're discussing, or he's not drawing on the activity that we're doing. So I can still look at those observable behaviors or symptoms, or the things that kiddos say, like, I'm feeling really worried. Does that mean that it's necessarily an anxiety disorder? No. But can we still address that behavior of the kiddo feeling worried? Of course. So looking at it as observable behaviors and observable symptoms instead of the label can make this process so much more palatable for parents who are still trying to work through that diagnostic labeling system themselves.
Yeah, I'm looking at Darren because this is kind of the argument that happens in my house, because I feel the same way. I mean, it's the label of my oldest of, they wanted of the ADHD, and my wife wants to turn to that more than she does the anxiety that I see, through his dealing with homework and classroom and that kind of stuff. So it's difficult. It is very difficult.
But you laid it out very, in a nice way that
Sure.
It's not really about the label as much as it is about kind of the underlying symptoms, so to speak. There was a book called The Misunderstood Child by and Larry Levine, I believe it was, and he puts anxiety right next to attention, and he compares the symptoms of each, and they're so alike.
Yes.
And ultimately, it's hard to differentiate. And I think parents kind of, you can read so much now, and with, modern technology, you can really bury yourself and say, you know what, this is this. Yep. And really, when you do what you're saying, looking at the child and the circumstance and observing the different behaviors, they almost have to become, well, you have to teach them to be more like you, in a sense, and I think it's hard for us as parents because we're so emotional in the moment that, it's hard to observe behavior when you're actually trying to deal with it.
Right. It's hard to observe behavior when you're doing the work of parenting, but when you have a professional come in and take a step back, it can also help parents to start to see that behavior as a behavior. And taking a step back and saying, oh, this tantrum is overwhelming, it's way easier to come back and say, oh, this particular behavior is affecting my child negatively, and how do I get more information about it? It's kind of like looking at your child like they're a science experiment.
Yeah, well, and that's that objectivity piece, right? I mean, that's so important as a scientist. So then after you've kind of got a better grip on the behavior, then we move to C, right?
Right. And C is my favorite part of this process because C stands for consequences. And we often think of consequences as bad. We think of like a negative consequence. Most parents come into my office and say, well, yeah, we have consequences at home. We take away their phone or their iPad all the time. I'm like, okay, that's a good start. But consequences from a purely behavioral, psychological perspective actually just mean whatever happens after the behavior. So once we've got our behavior defined, we can start to look at what are the immediate consequences, whatever happens in the situation right after that behavior. So we're going to get a little bit more scientific and talk about the two major types of consequences. And I'm using the terminology from operant conditioning from our old friend and psychologist, B.F. Skinner. But we're looking at reinforcers and punishments. So if we look at a consequence as anything that happens after a behavior, a reinforcer is anything that happens after a behavior that increases that behavior. On the flip side, a punishment is anything that decreases that behavior. So we think about, for example, a reinforcer could either be a reward, like a sticker or a pat on the back, or it could be something like attention. Attention is a big reinforcer for a lot of kids, whether that attention is, hey, good job, buddy, or it's a lecture. So reinforcers can be tough to piece apart. And then those punishments definitely can be positive or negative as well. So when we look at consequences, they're either positive, they're adding something to the situation directly following the behavior, or they're negative and they're removing something directly after the behavior. So all that is to say, we've got 4 different categories of consequences, and they're all going to do something different to your kiddo's behavior. It gets a little complicated, but I like to talk about it in terms of examples. So a positive reinforcer is something that's both added to the situation and increases the desired behavior. So like I was talking about, like a gold star sticker or a prize, that's something additive that's going to improve and increase that behavior. But we also have the flip side of a negative reinforcer, something that's removed but increases the desired behavior. So for example, I will coach parents a lot on removing the nagging that comes after a positive behavior. So if a kiddo completes their math homework but maybe hasn't finished English yet, we remove the nagging about English homework, and that kiddo is actually reinforced for completing their math. It's mind-blowing, but it's really, really hard to do as a parent.
Yeah.
And then on the flip side, we've got those positive and negative punishments. So it sounds like an oxymoron to say positive punishment, but we do it all the time. A positive punishment is something that's added but decreases the behavior. So for example, if we add extra chores, that's a positive punishment. We just added something to the kiddo's day, to their to-do list, but it's going to make them not want to do whatever behavior preceded it. And then the negative punishment.
Titled our podcast "Positive Punishment."
Basically. And then the opposite is true. Sorry, should I finish the?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay. The last part is negative punishment. So whatever is removed, but also decreases that problem behavior. My favorite negative punishment is actively ignoring whatever behavior we don't want to see more of. So this is when I'm sitting in my office and kiddo was whining because they don't want to be in a therapy office, and myself and the parent included ignore the whining child until it stops. And all of those things put together can be really complicated, but they give you options for whether you are actively making that behavior increase or decrease, and how.
Sure. And I'm sure it takes a lot of trial and error.
Yeah, you don't mind. Brian and I are sitting here with our mouths open, going, "I'm gonna
thinking about later when I have to go home."
So, an example of positive punishment might be spending more, like going to the movies with your child, or going daddy time on Sunday afternoon.
So that would be actually a positive reinforcer. So those are things like, okay, you did all of your homework and you turned it in on time this week. Then you add that positive reinforcement and say, we're going to go have a daddy-daughter or daddy-son movie date. Those are really excellent reinforcers, especially for older kiddos, because they're meeting that behavioral goal throughout the week. And that can be part of a really positively framed reward system that can help you to change the kiddo's behavior in a way that doesn't include all of that yelling and nagging and the stuff that we don't want to be doing as parents, because it just doesn't feel fun.
Do you suggest adding that in there? And, if it's separated, is that cause a problem? So like, hey, you did all your homework, you turned it in on time. So because you did that, we're going to go to the movies.
Yes, definitely. The more closely that you can link the kiddo's behavior to whatever the consequence is. So if they're being reinforced, being rewarded for a behavior, make that really clear. If there's a punishment for the behavior that you're seeing, for example, you didn't get your homework in on time, so therefore you can't go out to the movies on Friday night, then that should be made really clear too. Because as much as the human brain responds to all of this operant conditioning on its own, it's going to be a lot easier for your kiddo if you make the system really clear.
Can we talk about feasibility of goals? So
Yeah.
I had a friend of mine who was going to do a point system, 40,000 points for his 6-year-old, and if she made it by November, then they would go to Disneyland. I was trying to explain that's not exactly feasible, but
That's a lot. Well, it's a lot for a 6-year-old to even wrap their brain around, because when we look at like the developmental trajectory of any kiddo, we want to make sure that, the goals are feasible for their age, and that the rewards and reinforcers we're picking are also appropriate to their age. So anyone under the age of 10 is probably not going to look forward to Disney World if it's still 6 to 8 months away. They want to go, but they're going to need those smaller reinforcers. Like when you get 5 stars, you get to pick out a small toy, and they can still be working toward Disney World, but having something along the way gives their brain that extra boost of feel-good chemicals so that they actually are learning the positive behavior as they're earning their bigger rewards.
And is it do you suggest just staying the course? Because I can tell. I mean, like with my 6-year-old, if you do something like that, he wants a game or something on Nintendo Switch. It's like, all right, so clean up your room or clean up the toy room for a week, and on Friday we'll get that. And then it's like, he misses a day or two. How do you where's the balance there, I guess?
Yeah, that's the tough part, is that we want the system of reinforcers to be something that kiddos can realistically earn, and we want to follow through when they don't earn it. So I try to set up my reward systems with families to be things that realistically the kiddo's going to earn, because we want to rig the system so that they feel successful and that we feel successful as the adults.
Sure.
So sometimes I'll set something up where, okay, if kiddo is having separation anxiety and we're asking them to stay in their own room every night for a week, maybe I'll make the goal 5 nights out of 7, because I know that they can do it 5 nights out of 7, and then they get that reinforcer. And like I said, when you get the reinforcer, your brain is flooded with all these feel-good chemicals, and you're like, wow, I worked hard for this. I want it again. And then we can start to up the goal and make it 6 days or 7 days. But we want to start with something that's definitely doable. And then if they don't earn what we said they were going to earn, we've got to follow through on that. And say, you know what, you didn't earn it this week, but we're going to switch up the goal and you'll probably earn it next Friday. You just got to work a little harder.
Sure.
So it sounds like we can do a little game here, right? So we've got ABC, right? So how about we just kind of talk about some circumstances and then take us back to, right through the ABC of the circumstance.
Sounds great.
So I have one that happened basically last night. And obviously we know that there's a lot more involved, and there's just because we're mentioning what one behavior might be, we know there's a backstory, and there's all kinds of other things. But for example,
right.
So my son was playing around last night. He decided to take the water pick and then spray it against the ceiling. Right. So we walk in and it's kind of like, ceiling is soaking wet, and there's that moment. And then the backstory is that this was a day where he had a book report. He had to go to school early for an event. So he was certainly kind of done, like physically. And so do you need any more information, or shall we walk through?
No, that sounds perfect. So it sounds like if we start with the antecedents, you were talking about like the immediate trigger of the situation. Well, he was feeling silly and playing around. So it wasn't like he was in a particularly bad mood, but when you put it in the context of, okay, got to school early, had to do a book report, like it was a long day, that really diminishes anyone's self-control. And for kiddos, and for my puppy who's sitting over here, they get extra wiggly at the end of the day. So if we understand what's going on in terms of triggering that event, yeah, a long day at school, had to do all this stuff, feeling extra silly and just playing around, that self-control at that time of day was probably way lower for him at that time than it might have been for the whole rest of the day. So sometimes the trigger event is just, having a long day and feeling silly, or having an idea pop into your head that maybe isn't the best idea, but he did it anyway.
This is true. Science
Very
experiment.
true. Yep.
And so the consequence for such an event?
So, the consequence of that event, well, my first question for any parent is what really did happen in the moment? Like, what happened when you or your wife discovered that the water, or that the ceiling was soaking wet because he sprayed the water pick at it?
What happened in the moment? I took the water bottle away, and
But can the consequence be him knowing that, like, Darren was mad or not happy?
For sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
well, I think there's another piece here, right? So he's 11, and I'm 6'4", right? So, and I remember the nanny, super nanny, right? So in that moment, I didn't go down to his level, right? And so, in retrospect, I certainly should have gotten down at a lower level and said, that wasn't a good idea, bud, and had a kind of like a conversation about it. But I don't think I'm not really a voice raiser, but I think, just having that difference, and, it's a 2-foot height difference, and, I'm not 120 pounds either. So I think, that's the lesson learned on my side, but I think the consequence really, go ahead. Sorry. I'm trying to justify my behavior.
No, and it's funny because I always remind parents, like, whatever you did in the situation, it's over. It doesn't matter. Even if we're
right. Yeah, but you learn for the next one, right?
Yeah, it's data. I like to remind families that no matter what happens, if the behavior was the worst thing you've ever seen, or if you're really disappointed in whatever you did as a parent, which in this case, no need to be, but it's data. So we know that whatever kiddo did, not the best idea. But the consequence that you figured out was you took the water bottle away. So it wasn't something where he got yelled at. It wasn't something where you got super mad about it. It was just, okay, bad idea. You can't do that. And honestly, the avoidance of, you didn't get down on his level to have a conversation about it. Who knows if he was actually ready for that conversation in the moment because he was feeling silly and wiggly and thought it was a great idea to spray the ceiling. So sometimes in the moment, it is really useful for parents and kids to just say, okay, I'm taking this away now, and have a moment for everyone to calm down, even if they're just wiggly and not mad. Then you can have a conversation about it later and say, hey, remember yesterday when you sprayed the ceiling and it got all wet? That wasn't the best idea. So in the future, let's keep the water in the sink, or at least on the counter. Like, that's how I would rephrase it and just say, you know what? Not a good idea. Here's the positive opposite of the behavior that we saw.
Yes, because we often migrate to automatically the negative and not like you said, the positive opposite. It's a matter of the way we're delivering it.
I think we have
Exactly.
time for one more of those, and Brian's up.
Perfect.
Oh, thanks. Well, we live in a neighborhood with where my little guys can go outside, and the 6 and the 8-year-old can be by themselves. And yesterday, my mother and brother were watching them, so my wife and I could go out somewhere, and got a panicked phone call that my brother could not find them. And they have forged a friendship with 2 little girls down the street, and I guess they had gone into their house. And eventually that's where we sent my brother, but we were away obviously when that was going on. I was able to, I think the lesson was driven home when they came back to the house and saw my mother was very upset. Her nanny. And there really wasn't a need. I didn't know what I was doing in the moment. I was ready to blow my stack over the phone. But in the moment, being away from it, now even hearing you say it again, it helps. It helps to know. I said to them later when they were going to bed, I said, what's the lesson there? What did we learn? That we just got to check in before we go into the neighbor's house, so we don't give our uncle a heart attack.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like in this situation, if we go through those ABCs, like an antecedent was, well, it wasn't mom and dad that were watching the kiddos, it was family members.
Yes.
So sometimes the expectations are a little bit unclear, or kiddos think that they can get away with more depending on who's watching them. And I see this happen all the time with babysitters or grandma and grandpa or aunts or uncles. Like, the expectations also need to be clear when kiddos are being watched by other people. So kiddos thought they had a little extra leeway, and they've probably been to that neighbor's house before. So I can totally see how that behavior came about. And then it sounds like in the moment, I mean, they had the consequence of having to see their grandma upset, which was probably not fun. No. But you're also totally right that you weren't there in the moment to be super upset or super worried, and you were able to, keep your cool and talk to them about it later and say, you know what, the new rule is, this is kind of like in the last situation, we set a new rule when we figure out that something could be a problem. We say, the new rule is, if you want to go to the neighbor's house, you've got to talk to your uncle or your grandma first. Yeah. Just so that we can keep track of you. And that's a really calm, logical way of putting it, instead of having that consequence of putting so much attention on the behavior, like, oh my gosh, we were so worried, we're so mad at you. Yep. If you understand why the behavior occurred, you learn from it, you set a new rule, and you move on. Sounds like hopefully that can be something that the kiddos keep in mind in the future.
Well, hopefully their mother and father can keep that in mind too.
Agreed.
To be able to keep that maybe take ourselves outside of the moment, even if we're standing there physically, and not, be able to, like you said, drive the lesson home maybe after everybody calms down.
So
we're for sure.
We're looking at our airline flights. I think I can get down to Texas pretty soon
with the whole family for a group session.
So sit there and observe behaviors and ABC all day.
Yeah, there it is. So how can people get a hold of you down in Austin? And
I know your website has some resources on it.
Yeah, so my website is Dr. Vivyan, so drvivyan.wordpress.com, and that's where I'm always updating my people, my clients, on where I'm at and what I'm doing. So right now I am working at this amazing private practice, Austin Anxiety and OCD specialist. I've also done some work with nonprofits and schools in Texas. So I'm always up to something fun. I'm always trying to help kiddos and their families to figure out behaviors and emotions. So if people want to get a hold of me, my website is a good place to go. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter at Dr. Vivyan, so DRVIVYAN. I'm always posting and ready to converse on those platforms as well.
Great. Well, we will definitely include all of those in the show notes when we put them together with this episode, and make sure folks know how to get a hold of you. And we will include that blog piece that you wrote on the topic of today, ABCs of behavior.
Great.
Well, thank you very much. This was a great conversation, and I'm sure it won't be the last. We always like to open the invitation to have you back. And,
awesome.
Yeah, we appreciate your time and your knowledge, and we're going to go implement your strategies.
Awesome. That sounds great. Thank you both for having me. This is really fun.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast with your hosts, Darren and Brian. Find them on social media at Sound Foundations for Parenting. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe. And we'll catch you next time on the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast.